Boardroom Bound, episode 105, How to Master Leadership Growth in the Boardroom with Jim Crocker.
Right, so the board, the organization, a lot of the organizations need strategies to counter that risk, and that's why a lot of them have opened up their own online portals and their own e-businesses and that kind of thing. And that's a reaction to a risk. So that's the first reason for having a strategy. The second reason for having a strategy is all risk aside. We want to execute our mission better. Right? And I define mission as who do we serve and how do we serve them. So,
hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Jim Crocker. Jim is the chair at Boardroom Metrics. And this is a governance and strategy consulting firm for private businesses and associations, and helps them figure out how to do the best stuff in the boardroom. So Jim's going to illuminate us with some of the experiences that he tells his clients about, how he helps them, how he coaches them, what they do for them as an organization, what he's seeing in the industry, and what we can all learn from their full service management consulting company and the advice that they're giving to companies. Let's jump into the show. Jim Crocker, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Alexander. A real pleasure.
Well, I'm excited today because even just on the conversation you were having before we started the official conversation here, we almost did our own show. There's just so much we want to unpack about. This is governance geeks having conversations here today to some extent, right? It's like, what should a board do? Where does it start? Where does it stop? How does it work? So we're going to get through all that, but let's set the scene for our audience today. Before we get into that, you didn't get to the point where you're at now, where you're running Boardroom Metrics as your first job. That was a culmination of many years and experiences. Can you give us a sense of where your career started, what you went through in order to get to where you are today?
Yeah, my full career, literally started my career in sales as selling dog food for General Foods, if that makes any sense. And it turns out that getting sales experience was great, but I progressed through that and got an opportunity to go into consulting at a fairly young age, but really good consulting with just excellent clients, Pepsi's and the beer companies and Kraft and Procter & Gamble, people like that. So good consulting background, and part of that, Alexander, is I got a chance to then run a public company listed on the Venture Exchange. I'm in Canada, so listed on the Venture Exchange here in Toronto, and then we took it onto the Toronto Stock Exchange. So for 6+ years, I was a public company CEO, and that was my first exposure to corporate governance. I had never been on a board before, but as a CEO in that case had a board seat. So I came on and had a chance to, experience the board, observe it, and I know part of the focus of your podcast is, how to then how do you get on board? It was interesting. So I've never had board experience until then, but once I got onto that board and as CEO, then I got a number of other opportunities to go onto other boards. So I had
was it really as simple as that? People started calling you up because now you had that public company CEO behind you?
I wish I could tell you it was more complicated, but for me, that's how it happened. It almost immediately. Now, part of it was I was in the tech space, so being on a tech board, I think was relevant to people who were looking for directors. But I think the consulting background also helped. But no, it was that easy. I went on to a hospital board, which was obviously a fascinating experience and different from being on a public company board. But that was a case where they were looking for more business experience, on their hospital board. So so one thing kind of led to another, and. I think then in terms of following that through at Boardroom Metrics, it was especially my observations on the role around being the public company CEO, and you and I were talking about this. What I observed over the 6 years was a couple things, and I observe it to this day with all boards that we work with. Number one, the directors just really cared. They put in a lot of time, a lot of effort to do a great job, and I really appreciated that. But I also observed that nobody was working from a common playbook. It was everybody sort of had their own perspective in terms of, as a director especially, if they were performing strong governance, what did that mean? And I can tell you what it meant from a CEO perspective. It meant that on any given day, or any given board meeting, you could get a bunch of new ideas, a bunch of new thoughts, because somebody had been reading something or talking to somebody or whatever, and all of a sudden they spotted a new risk or they had a new thought on strategy. And it was almost like there was this expectation that we'd now bounce around and add something else to the mix in terms of what we do. And obviously that organizations can't work that way. But directors were always always able to, and I observe this to this day, directors were always able to sort of rationalize that as that I'm doing my job as a director, right? I've spotted this new risk, so we better take an hour out of the board meeting and talk about this new risk because that's my job as a director. And my conclusion ultimately was it was pretty ineffective. It didn't help, and there had to be a more organized way of coming about sort of the role of the board of directors and the role of a director in terms of how to do that. That would both provide better governance and certainly better in terms of operating the business. So that's, I don't know, sorry for the ramble there, but that was kind of my background. And from there, when I came out, we started Boardroom Metrics.
So there's a lot to unpack here. This is great. This is a very good starting point. But let's dial it back to when you were CEO of a company and now board roles are appearing for you, because many people on our show are aspiring and they might be very near to them, might be knocking on the door. They might be in the C-suite themselves or the level below that, or even perhaps further out in their planning. So I would love for you to do a little bit of reflection, both from that experience of like, now I have this checkbox, I have this badge, so people say I'm ready to go, and what you're seeing now where you're working with organizations, what actually helps someone to be ready, right? So when someone calls up and says, we think you're ready to be a board director, how would they actually know whether they are?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in a lot of cases, frankly, directors aren't ready. I wasn't ready. Just being honest. But I think, what did I have that people thought made me ready? So it would be having some governance background. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of people, and I encourage it, a lot of people, their first exposure to governance would be on it could be the local baseball association, it could be the local, soccer association, it could be a not-for-profit, right, local humane society. So certainly having something on, the resume, on the LinkedIn profile that shows some governance understanding is really, really helpful. Boards, I would say to boards, don't eliminate somebody because they don't have governance experience. It's easier to teach a marketing person governance than it is to teach a governance person marketing, but boards do tend to still go looking for people with governance background. I think the other thing, Alexander, would be, it's interesting. Spencer Stewart every year puts out their board index for a whole bunch of countries, and you probably see them, and they're fascinating. Most years are sort of semi-inconsistent from year to year, but most years they will refer to what are boards looking for in their directors? What skills and expertise are they looking for? And always at the top, right? So this is the reality. They're always looking for either current or past operating experience. Right. So, being able to promote that. So that's senior level, director level in, large organizations, substantial organizations, certainly CEO experience, board chair experience. There's always that. So it's that, I understand governance, I understand operating, is always really important. Boards are always looking for financial experience. So that's high up there. People who have those kinds of backgrounds are going to naturally be in the mix. I think one of the observations over the past bunch of years, I call it boards becoming more competency-based. And I think boards are getting clearer that, the examples I would use would be something like social media. So even just going back to Spencer Stewart, what I noticed over the past couple of years was that social media experience has grown from like almost nothing in terms of what boards are looking for on a board to it's now become, I'm not going to get the number wrong, but it's like almost 20% of people of boards had sort of recognized that as something they're looking for. Cybersecurity expertise, right? Yeah. We all recognize that there's risk there. Boards recognize it. So they're going looking for those specific pieces of expertise. So I think in terms of, long ramble to your question, but I think... Well,
no, I agree with that. Another one I'd add in there is probably HR. I'm seeing a lot more chief HR officers being added.
Exactly. And the COVID experience, I think, is going to add to that. I think there's going to be a lot of relevance now. HR has worked hard over the years to be more strategic and to be included at the boardroom table. And they've really, in my mind, they've really struggled with that. I think, one of the changes we're going to see is that, we're going to want these HR people at the boardroom table. So I think, being able to reflect this expertise, in resumes, in the backgrounds we're using to look for board roles, I think is really, really important. I'll go back to where I started, though. I do think and as I said, earlier, I don't necessarily like it, but a lot of boards will eliminate someone if they don't have some kind of governance experience. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's right, but I think it's a reality.
It's interesting.
And that's where if you can get on if the first board gig or the first 3 board gigs are unpaid, my advice to anybody would be take them. Take them. Get that on your resume.
I was going to say it's really interesting. We're starting to see more and more first-time board members coming into this space, which is a reflection of multiple things. But if you have a certain skill set that someone needs, you talked about social media or cyber, things like that, it can be easier to make that jump. But in general, it's sort of that old conundrum: how do you get a job that experience? How do you get experience without a job? And it's one of those things. Your network I think is part of the answer, right? You have to have the sponsors who are going to help you do it. But I agree with you. It's also, I would think, it's how you package yourself. So you might have reported into a board, presented to a board. You've just got to do whatever storytelling you can to show how you've been in that space.
Yeah. And I think and in that case, I would say it's really, and I think people do this, but think of it for someone who wants to get a good board gig. Think of it, it's like looking for any job, right? So it really is a case that you've touched on it. It's all those things you would do if we were out looking for a job. It is in the networking. It's the letting people know, in the network that this is what I'm looking for. It's talking to people like you, people like me, in terms of how am I positioning myself. Does my LinkedIn profile clearly reflect that this is what I'm interested in? There are recruiters out there, right? There are recruiters who just recruit for boards of directors. Let those recruiters know. So there's a lot of common steps to just finding, any role that also apply to finding a board role.
I think that makes great sense. And there's something else you were talking about before that I just found so fascinating. You were talking about that most people, when they come onto a board, may not have a sense for how to do things the right way or the correct way or the totality of what they're supposed to do. And I know this will be a larger conversation around governance. I was curious, when you joined your first board, you were the CEO, or perhaps when you joined a board after that, outside of that company organization, I would love to know about your onboarding experience. I know there have been a lot more sophistication placed into this, but I think it still varies wildly by company of how much time and effort and energy is spent on that, which you think is ironic because your employees at all levels are being onboarded. Like some companies say only on Mondays, those are the days we do it because we've got everybody prepared and things like that. But boards sometimes just get thrown into it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think I agree with everything you said. So certainly back when I came onto the boards I came onto, I think the best onboarding I got was the hospital board, where we probably took like half a day to wander around the hospital. I think in almost every other case, Alexander, I don't think I got any onboarding. I think my onboarding would show up at the first meeting, get some material, show up at the first meeting, and try to keep my mouth shut so I wouldn't make a fool of myself and do some learning. So there wasn't great training and onboarding. Certainly, also part of your point. Since then, I've seen a lot more sophistication attempts brought to onboarding the directors in terms of the organization and that kind of thing. I still think, and again we talked about this before we got recording, I see that onboarding is pretty good. I still continue to see though that especially new directors, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the board role and what the director role is, and I still think there's a fairly huge gap in most boards and their onboarding in terms of what that is, and what does governance mean, and what is our role, and how does it get done? And one thing I would love to see, it's one of the things we actually work on, is helping organizations get really clear, right, in their materials and everything else. What is the role of the board? What is the role of a director? Because it's actually fundamental, right? It's one thing to, without understanding that, it's really, really difficult to show up at a board meeting. And I think, we can all be smart, we can sound smart and all that, but we're not necessarily providing good governance. I'll go back to my experience as a CEO. It's a bit like really, really, really good people who are trying to be helpful, sharing their brilliance and expertise, but without a context for doing that, really, really not that helpful.
So, I'd love to take a deep dive into this, but one side note, I was a little bit surprised hearing your story about the board members who want to be helpful and we're giving all of this thoughts and guidance. We want that to some extent, but we want to channel it through the right way. Now, the answer might be different if the CEO is also the chairman, maybe that you go through the lead independent director. But I would have thought the guidance would be that most of those board directors should be funneling it to the right person on the board, because the CEO can't take the calls from all the different board members. That's not appropriate. Can you give us a little more context by what was happening and what would you recommend in that situation?
Yeah. So I'll give you some context just on mine, and I think it's different by company, right? So certainly in the case, I was running a technology, spin-off where the original inventors, so to speak, of a pretty cool technology were still involved. So that was part of it. So this doesn't exist everywhere, but they certainly had sort of missed the memo on don't call the CEO every day. So that was part of it. And we finally had to deal with it. Right? We had to put a policy in place so that everybody recognized, don't phone the CEO every day to do that. And that came as a result of me literally putting up my hand and saying, I can't do this. But I think even without that, I observe this in boards I work with today, is that, so let's say, directors aren't calling the CEO on an individual basis, but they're coming to board meetings or they're getting to the board chair, or they're getting to the governance chair with their latest great idea on what it is the board should be dealing with. And, so that ultimately, without some kind of good understanding by the board chair or the governance chair or whatever, too many of those brilliant thoughts find their way onto the agenda, into conversations at the board level. And, I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but one of the biggest issues that boards still deal with is sort of this reality of, although they're fearful of being too deep in operations, a lot of boards still end up too deep in operations. And, that's part of where this comes from is, directors sort of on a regular basis coming up with the latest, greatest idea. And I don't think I'm putting down directors. I'm not. Again, it comes back to training and sort of what's the structure we need in place to do that. We want good thinking, but it needs to be in a structure that fits with the corporate governance of the organization. But to just have it come willy-nilly, the CEO can't deal with that, the board can't deal with that, and and the organization can't deal with that. So it needs to be structured, and it needs to be prioritized, because every great idea, companies, organizations, boards are like humans. We only have so much capacity, so we can't just throw every idea we've got in terms of what could be better at a board or an organization on a regular basis.
Jim, I like that, and I want to explore this a little bit more, but I also want to give our audience some historical context. If we go back, 30, 40 years, when you think about a board meeting and you showed up once a quarter, the board did not probe that much into management. You trusted management to do their job. That's what they're supposed to do. And if you started to ask too many questions about the boardroom, there'd be strong pushback from management. Whoa, you guys are getting into our space. You remember where you're supposed to be, okay? You only get a few questions. That's the way it works. But what you're describing now is much more the other side of people going, we don't want to be the next Uber. We don't want to be the next Viacom. We're worried about COVID-19. We have all of these things. Help us help you, right? We're going to ask you the right questions. You'll give us the answers. And you're clearly saying that's too far as well. Help us understand what's the right answer to it.
Yeah. So okay, Alexander, I think that's where I sort of like to get into how I view the role of the board. Right?
Please.
So and then that'll tie then to how does the board deal with that? So 3 roles of the board, right? And I really believe this helps keep it simple. Number 1 is risk. So what are the risks that are coming at the organization? And this is sort of the thinking about the risk. This is the kind of stuff that happens as a board gets into its strategic plan. But what are the risks coming at an organization? And therefore, I call them authors, but 4 authors of risk. One is, financial risk. We make a bad investment, we go to business. Second would be legal risk. We do something illegal, we end up in jail. The third would be market risk, which is something coming at us from the marketplace. It could be a new government regulation. It could be a new competitor. It could be an innovation. It could be COVID-19, right? So it's what's coming at us from outside that's a risk to us. And then the 4th thing is operating risk. We're doing something, we're running a hospital or we're doing something like that where, hey, we better have our act together in terms of how we're doing it, because people's lives or how we operate is really in jeopardy. So boards need to get really good at understanding those risks. And so that's goal 1. And just a quick thought on that. I think boards are generally pretty good at the financial side. I mean, I haven't been to many board meetings where there hasn't been a finance report. Right? Legally, I've observed that boards do a pretty good job. But I do think in terms of boards are not getting enough information in terms of the market risk. Right? They're really not. And they're not getting enough information in terms of the operating risk. And this is where the board gets a chance, frankly, to get a sense of, what are those things? How are we operating? What dashboards or whatever do we need to understand how the organization is operating? But kind of to your point there, to focus on this first part of the board's role, the time to really think hard about those and prioritize those risks is in the planning process. What are those risks that are out there? That then leads to the second role of the board, which is strategic planning. And why do we have strategic planning? 2 reasons. Right? 1 is to mitigate risk. Right? We've identified that. I always use this example, but a lot of my clients are in the distribution business. Right? So for years, Amazon has been an incredible risk. Right? So the board, the organization, a lot of these organizations need strategies to counter that risk, and that's why a lot of them have opened up their own online portals and their own e-businesses and that kind of thing. And that's a reaction to a risk. So that's the first reason for having a strategy. The second reason for having a strategy is, all risk aside, we want to execute our mission better. Right? And I define mission as who do we serve and how do we serve them. So, let's start with Amazon. Amazon wasn't facing risk. Amazon's strategy to execute their mission better was, in fact, to do what they do, in all these areas, but certainly the online strategy. So those are the 2 reasons to have strategy. So we've identified the risk. That then leads to, a strategic plan that clearly lays out how we're going to mitigate those risks and how we're going to execute our mission better. And then the third role of the board is to monitor and measure the CEO. I call it performance manage the CEO, because I'm not sure we generally think about this way, but the role of the CEO is to execute the strategic strategic direction of the board of directors. Now, in cases which is a lot of organizations where there isn't a great strategic plan, and frankly, it's the CEO who's doing it, it doesn't always look that way. But from a governance perspective, really the way it's, theoretically works is the board has bought off on a solid strategic plan, and now we're expecting the organization to execute that, led by the CEO. And the CEO is that one employee who reports to the board. So the board has to, monitor and measure and sort of help the CEO perform as best as they possibly can. So I would say those are the three roles of the board: risk, strategy, and performance management of the CEO. So when you then get, and they've been prioritized in that process. It started in the planning process. We've set priorities in the planning process. And the only way those priorities change, kind of something you touched on, COVID would be a great example. Not many organizations, although I would argue many organizations should have done a better job of at least being semi-prepared, but most organizations didn't. But when it came along, it was really clear, like, this was not some minor operating issue. Mm-hmm. This fundamentally changes our strategy. So, when something that big comes along, it now fits into sort of a strategic direction that, the board should be expecting that management would now have a plan for that. And now the board should be measuring and monitoring the organization, the CEO, in terms of how they're executing. Right. But other than that, these things have all really been built into the planning up front. And providing good corporate governance actually gets pretty simple, because even boards, I'll give you another simple example, even board meetings now can focus around, okay, let's talk about risk. Let's put time aside and talk about risk. Let's now talk about strategy. How's the strategic plan going? And then finally, let's talk about performance management with CEO. So this is a really simple tweak that we use, but realigning board meeting agendas to specifically focus on risk, strategy, and performance management. And back to our conversation earlier, what that does is it tends to take then the focus away from, or even the opportunity to focus on operating issues that may be so much fun to talk about. But, really they don't fit into that. If we keep the board through its processes focused on risk, strategy, and CEO performance, boards can do a much better job. And one of the really cool things as a result of being organized this way is governance not only gets simpler, it actually gets quicker. Board meetings get shorter because the information we get, the decisions we make, the things we're focused on are truly focused around, these three areas of corporate governance. And I say to boards, if you're talking anything else, other than these three things, you're probably wasting your time on some of the wrong stuff. So now it's easier, back to our earlier conversation, now it's easier for the CEO, it's easier for the board, it's easier for everybody, because there's clear focus around those three areas. Does that kind of make sense?
I love the way you laid that out. I think that makes absolute sense. There's so much to uncover within this. And just the last point you made about how does the board spend its valuable time and use its talents well, you don't get together very often. Like, you need to be efficient and effective. I think one wrinkle on this scenario, which I'd love for you to talk about, is a phenomenon much more common in the U.S. than many other parts of the world, where the CEO is also the chairman. And we could talk about potential conflicts of interest here, and there are some that probably do it really well, and we've seen others that clearly do not do it very well. What are your thoughts on this?
So my thoughts are strong, and hopefully I won't offend anybody, but what I would say, if you have an organization where the CEO is also the board chair, you can't have corporate governance. Mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. On the basis of what I've just explained, risk, strategy, and performance management, right. CEO, you can't, unless the two are separated, right? The role of the board is fundamentally different from the role of CEO.
Right.
And when you mix those two together, it's governance is absolutely impossible. In fact, it was going to be one of my, thinking of sort of tips for people coming onto a board, but one of my tips would be really careful about the kind of board you're going on to, because that would be one of the clues. If you're being attracted onto a board where the chair is the CEO, recognize that you're basically going on. You're not going on to a governance board. You're going on to an operating board, right? Because the two are really different, right? And operating boards will tend to they'll do the operating side better first, and then governance will be secondary. But it's impossible for an operating board to provide good governance, because there truly is, to your point, serious conflict of interest. Serious conflict of interest. So,
I would agree. Yeah. I'd agree. It's hard to be impartial. And they talk about having a lead independent director. Yeah. I think that's a lot more public facing than it is. If you have a strong CEO chairman, it's hard for anybody else to really give those opinions, because I agree with you. I think the board's main number one job, I would say, is finding the CEO, hiring that person and nurturing them through the process. I agree with the management. Like you said, you can't do that if he's also your boss.
You can't. It's impossible. possible. And I think, I don't know who all listens to podcasts, but even for investors, I think it's an important concept. And I know it's okay to mention companies here, but you need to be careful when you're looking at companies like a Tesla or a Facebook or places like that, where just by the share structure and by the organization, Elon Musk lost his chair. He lost his chairman title. But essentially, you're looking in some of these cases that are essentially private companies who have gone out to take advantage of the public market, but they're still operating like private companies.
Sure.
Right? The governance structure is very much private, not public. And that's as an investor or an employee, you have to sort of go, hey, I'm okay with that, and that's fine. But at least recognize that traditional corporate governance does not apply to those kinds of companies.
And Uber was an interesting example, right? So the CEO was stripped of his title, but he still had so many shares he was on the board, and even when he was thrown off the board, he still had his best friend on the board. So it's very awkward.
Absolutely. And the sort of the poster child of last summer was WeWork, right, which was just coming public. But you had an absolutely dominant, they worship him like a god type CEO, right? And look what happened there, right? I mean, the board did not do its job, and as a result, that going public did not happen.
Right.
It did not happen. So, and maybe I was going to make that one other point. Yeah. My observation as a consultant and someone who's worked with a lot of organizations now and watched organizations is that, and directors may not realize it, but governance fails way more regularly than people realize. Right? It doesn't get reported, like the headline isn't, another governance failure. It gets reported as, the CEO's been laid off, or there's been this scandal or whatever. But, especially, and it tends to be public companies because their stories are public. But generally, those are governance failures, right? Because the CEO, because the leadership team reports to the board, because the board has responsibility for the strategy, right? When you see organizations that, wipe out billions of dollars of shareholder value or lay off, thousands of employees, or I'm going to be really harsh here, or crash 2 airplanes because they focus too much on cost cutting, right? Which was a strategy established by the board, right? These are not, and then they fire their CEO. This is not a CEO problem. This is not a management problem. These things that show up in the press, and especially with respect to public companies, but it happens in all companies. These are failures of corporate governance. These are not management failures. And I think it's helpful. I'm going to go back to people listening to your podcast who are sort of want to learn and become good at this. I think paying attention to the headlines around corporate failures, corporate problems, go back and first question should be, where was the board? Because I guarantee the board had a role that it either didn't play or it played incorrectly. And I think generally investors, I think directors tend to miss that. And I think for directors who are on boards, here's another observation on governance failure. When governance fails, people get hurt. And, in Boeing's case, people got killed, right? But it could be investors who lose, in the case of Volkswagen had problems a couple of years ago, right? They're still dealing with it, but they wiped out, billions of dollars of shareholder value. You have, I just read an article this week, you have leaders of the organization who are going to jail, who are in jail. You have people who, the whole board structure changed, everything else changed. You had employees were laid off. Like, when governance fails, people get hurt. And I think directors need to sort of think really hard about that. I went through this experience constantly until I became clear on this. I think as we go on to boards, the first thing we check is, how's our directors, on the insurance? Am I covered if something goes wrong? Mm-hmm. But I think, I'd love to see directors thinking way more clearly on what happens to other people, right? If we don't get this governance role right, because, repeating 2 thoughts, 1, it happens all the time, it goes wrong. And 2, when it does, organizations and people always get hurt.
I think you've described that very well, Jim, and I agree with you. And there's so many cases where it's easy to see these sorts of problems. Wells Fargo would be an easy one to go with. But I think the fun story that I love, fun is the wrong word, is Lehman Brothers. The reason that Lehman Brothers collapsed was because when the board was assessing risks, they did not realize that management looked at what risk should go up in the limited time frame that they could review and took one out that said this scenario could ever happen and the markets would seize up and we would lose all liquidity. So they never considered that environment. Their board was packed with the smartest, best people you could imagine, and they missed it. And they never talked about it. And then, of course, the company went bankrupt. Billions of dollars were wiped away in equity. People lost their jobs.
And I hate to sound old and go back to part, but it ties right to that, right? You go back to the banks in 2008, and it's everything you just said. If you take a look at the directors on the banks that went under in 2008, these are some serious people, Right? These are absolutely serious people. But when you understand how those banks got themselves in trouble, those directors should never have been signing up and approving strategies that were so clearly not just misunderstood, where nobody understood the risks that those organizations were in. And I actually use that as an example. If it can happen to those organizations with those kinds of people, it can happen to your $15 million manufacturing company where we have 3 clients.
Sure.
Right? It can happen. Part of the point we try to make really, really strong is that these things can happen. I'll keep going on this, and I'll tell you the way it happens because I've seen a bunch and I've been involved in a couple in terms of as a consultant. But when they happen fast. Right? It's like everything is going great, and then there's a bit of a hint of something, and the next day you're on the front page of the business section. And I'll tell you, when that happens as a director, or as an organization, that is obviously incredibly devastating, right? And I'll go back to it. And what you can basically guarantee, the reason on the front page is because a bunch of people have just been hurt. So it can happen. It can happen to anybody, right? It can happen to any organization. It can happen to any board.
And I would stress that and agree with that, is that every director is one bad front page news story away from being a public official.
Yep, absolutely. And if I could just add to that, so it then tends to happen on the public. It sounds like we're just talking about public companies. It happens just as much, but it won't be as public profile. But it happens just as much in not-for-profit, in private companies. They face the role is exactly the same of a governance board in those organizations, and the risks are exactly the same. And so there's no real difference in terms of what the outcome could be by the board not performing its role properly.
Right. Jim, I think it's very obvious the way you've maybe distilled this down into simple levels, and it's not simple. Even if it's just risk, strategy, and the CEO management, there's clearly a lot of nuance underneath that. We can understand why you're a governance consultant and brought in to help all of these organizations to improve their governance effectiveness and their board strategy and their execution. And I'm going to encourage our people, we'll have a link in the show notes to go over to your websites at boardroommetrics.com. I know you have a few ebooks there that people are able to access, and clearly there's so much more we could be doing, and we should have several more episodes around this. I hate to shut this off in some ways, but we just sort of scratch the surface. Like, as governance geeks, this is just so much fun for me. And I'm so glad that we could have you on the show today. It was just a delight, and we appreciate you sharing your insights and helping all of our audience to be more boardroom bound.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. It was great.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Jim Crocker. It was great to hear about the work that they're doing at Boardroom Metrics, and I know that Jim has basically what I would say is his effective and uncomplicated approach to strong corporate governance and the insights that come from that, and I appreciate him sharing it with all of us today. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources. Please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.